That's it, Skybird here, and I was actually getting ready to make the mold for my Komau mask when I decided I should probably just kind of talk about the process that I go through when doing so. So one of the very first questions I started asking myself when I was making one-part molds was essentially, how do I fill in the holes in these masks? Some of these masks have a lot of holes in them, and in fact I believe all of the 2001 masks have holes of some kind. And so you can cast this directly or put this directly in silicone to mold, but when you do so, the silicone is actually going to flow through these molds and bond in those places, meaning that when I actually want to go extract this piece from the silicone for the first time, I actually have to cut through those manually, which can be a lot of effort, right? And not only that, especially if I'm using very very opaque silicones or silicones that are just hard to see through in general, oftentimes you're kind of going in blind. You don't know exactly where things are, right? Especially when it comes to the case of a mask like the Miru here, which has a pretty deep curve to it and a very sudden sort of shelf right there, which would make getting in there with a knife nearly impossible to actually cut the holes for the eyes. So what we want to do is try and solve that on the front end. Before we even go and cast or put this mask in silicone to make a mold of it, how do we go ahead and fill in those holes? There are a couple of things you can do, including using clear tape, but clear tape is not going to work for all different types of masks for various reasons. So the more optimal solution is actually using clay. And I know that this looks super ugly here, but we're not worried about the front side right now. This is a two-part process, and we're worried about the back. That's much cleaner. This is actually very easy to do, as intimidating as it might look to get things that clean, and I'm going to show that here in just a moment. I am using Chavant NSP clay. It's just a non-drying plastiline sulfur-free clay, so nothing terribly fancy there. You can get other brands as long as it's sulfur-free. Non-drying is going to be better for you when it comes to casting in general, and some brands of silicone are just going to react no matter what. So you do want to do some small tests, but I'll talk about ways you might be able to mitigate that here in a moment. So I'm actually going to show you this process here, and I'm going to do so with a Rao mask. It's going to be an ugly mask because this was actually an old dyed mask that I did, which was an absolute fail, but that's not important for this video. That said, this mask is a fairly easy one to backfill, so what we want to do is actually take just a little bit of clay, and this honestly is probably too much, but we'll just go ahead and flatten it out a little bit until we have something around the size of one of these eye holes. I'm going to put it on the front of the mask. I like doing this on the front side. It's just easier to get your fingers in certain masks. I'm going to do this for all of the holes that go all the way through the mask, not holes like this in the mouth here, but if they go through, if you can see light through them, that's where you really want to plug up. And we're going to go ahead and just push this until it actually starts to extrude through the mask. And this might take a little bit of effort, but don't worry, if you don't have enough there, just kind of squeeze some of it in. The whole point of this is to get it through the actual hole in the mask itself. Once we have it starting to go through, and I'm going to do just a little bit more. I'm actually pushing it into kind of both holes here on accident, but that's fine. Once we have it kind of through like this, it's actually starting to stick up just a little bit on the inside. I take the backside of my fingernail. It's just much easier to control than a knife or something else. And just kind of run it along the eye. You can go in either direction, but in this case, I went toward the outside of the eye because there was a very small gap in the corner, and so that can kind of push some clay into the corner there as well. Go ahead and take any clay that might be stuck to your finger off because you don't want to just spread it around, and then do it a couple more times. The idea here is we're trying to get as sharp of edges as possible. Ideally, we want the clay and the surface of the mask to be the exact same level, but if it's not, then what you want is the clay to be ever so slightly underfilled. Any overfill is going to create a void in the silicone in the future and can cause some issues when it comes to actually casting pieces later on and actually removing those masks. So that's a pretty good job there. It's really clean. There is a small spot though on the top of the eyebrow there that I actually got a little bit too much clay, and you can kind of see it. So what I'll do next is I'll grab just a cotton swab and just rub that off. The nice thing about this clay here is it's oil based and it really soaks into things like cotton swabs really well, but you're also not going to remove any of the clay that has mass to it, like a real good amount of clay. And it also doesn't stick very well, or the cotton fibers don't stick very well to it, so you won't really leave too much behind either. So that's a good way to clean it up, and now you can see that we really don't have any marks where the clay once was, And so we could take a little look at it again. There's a little bit of underfill in that corner there, but there's no light or anything coming through. So I'm not going to worry about that too much. So when I'm ready to actually cast, or sorry, I keep saying cast and mold interchangeably. When I'm ready to mold this piece, what I want to do beforehand, and this is just a preventative measure, it's not necessarily this step, but I like to do it anyway. Take just a little bit of petroleum jelly, does not matter the brand. You'll just rub a little bit of it on the tip of your finger, just so you can kind of thin it out a little bit. And then you just apply that over the surface of the clay. This is going to add another barrier between your silicone and the clay in case you do have inhibition problems with your brand of clay or your brand of silicone. It just adds a further step, a further thing between the clay and the silicone so that you won't run into issues with inhibition, because the petroleum jelly is not going to cause any kind of inhibition as far as I am aware. So once your petroleum jelly is on there, you're pretty much ready to mold this. However, I like to say just apply a little bit more petroleum jelly beforehand. So if I want to put this off until tomorrow or something, 10 minutes before I go ahead and mold it, I'll go ahead and rub some more petroleum jelly on there because a lot of it may have soaked into the clay. So for the rest of the video, you can kind of skip this if that was good information for you. But I want to talk a little bit about another modification I'm attempting with the book mold that I came up with. And so I don't have the piece in front of me because it's actually currently in the pressure pot, but it is my Mahiki mold, and I'm actually testing a ventless and funnel-less mold. It's just a concept. I don't know if it's going to work, but the nice thing is I can retroactively fit it with a funnel in the future, so it's not a waste of silicone, and it's also 50 grams of silicone because it's my book mold, which is just a modification on the cut mold. So as you can see, I'm sort of honing in on different types of molds and making very slight variations on the popular cut mold. So cut molds are not terribly popular in the Bionicle community specifically because they do have some disadvantages when it comes to casting very thin walled objects, what I like to call boats, right? Because it's got that kind of cavity in the middle, but it has walls on all sides. And the reason that's often the case is because the thinner the walls are, the more kind of surface tension you really have to deal with. So you need to use a resin that is very low viscosity, and you really kind of want to warm it up, thin it out as much as possible so that the resin has as little fight getting down to the bottom of this cast here. This is actually my retired Huna mold, but I still use it as a dump mold just to get rid of extra resin, or if I want to do test casts and stuff, it works out perfectly fine for my purposes. That said, the Huna is molded in there. You can see the shape of it. It is a messed up mold, hence why it is retired. It actually has a cut on the front side instead of the back side, which is where it should. But for cut molds specifically, they are going to leave you with more cleanup than a two-part mold oftentimes, but you have less sort of setup at the beginning and you're interacting with less products overall. As I mentioned, my silicone does not like the clay that I'm using very much, and so this was sort of an avenue I went down as a test that ended up working out reasonably well for me. It's not perfect. There are failure casts every once in a while, but the book mold is a modification on this. First of all, you can see that this has actually no vents. That's because it uses the funnel itself as the vent, which with low viscosity resins is a lot more successful than something that's thicker, right? Again, thicker resins need more vents anyway. And again, this was a test. I didn't know it was going to work, but it worked. So I stuck with it for now. It's not going to be perfect for everything, but let's go ahead and get into my modified mold. So the book mold, I'm just going to use this little piece of trash silicone here as an example. This was an experiment that I was running, but essentially the book mold fills up one of these cups rather than a full-size cup and actually lays the mask in there horizontally. A mask like the Miru is pretty tall, so this one actually might get a different type of mold, or I may actually run something around it to allow me to go a little bit higher. But point being, the mask in this case is horizontal, which presents an issue when it comes to extracting bubbles in the future. So how exactly do you get rid of bubbles? And so the method that I'm sitting on right now that seems to be working reasonably well for me is that normally with a cut mold, I'll show you this again as well. You don't only cut the top, but you also cut down the sides as well, right? And so that can help when it comes to like extracting bubbles and things like that, because if bubbles are going to accumulate lower in the model, they might have a way to escape, especially when pressure is applied. However, these molds are quite shallow, meaning that there's actually a slight advantage there, because essentially I make my cut here, and on my very first cut book mold, I actually did cut down the sides as well, and I made a T-shaped incision along the sides here so that the top would unfold like a book, hence why I called it that. With the new version, rather than making an incision on the side, I don't even break the side at all. So you can see here that my cuts don't actually extend all the way to the edge on either side. Rather, they only extend to the height of the mask. So if the Miru, for example, was inside of here, I'm only going to cut from the top of the Miru to the bottom of the Miru and give me a little bit of extra space on both sides. So maybe, you know, it can go to the edge if you need it to. But the extraction, rather than coming in at the side here, as mentioned, making the incision on the side, instead I'm making the incision on the top now and following along the edge of the mask itself, and this allows the bubbles to actually be pushed out through that incision from the pressure pot. Essentially the incisions can act like a form of vent. Then with my funnel-less version, this is not going to be a good way to show that because it's so shallow. I should use a full-size mold here, but again, they're all being used right now. With the new version of the mold, the funnel-less mold, what I'm essentially doing is this cut that I make right here, following along this line, actually opens up when I squeeze the mold, kind of like those old, you know, those paper origami, like fortune teller things from like the 90s and early 2000s. It kind of opens up like that. So when I actually squeeze the mold, it opens right where the two cuts meet, right in the crosshairs. And that can act as my funnel. So I squeeze the mold, I pour the resin in just a little bit at a time to kind of remove bubbles and allow bubbles time to escape. And then I continue to fill it. And then once it is basically as full as I can, because I have squeezed it, I've actually created a larger cavity inside. And so when I crush it down, it should force resin into all of the cavities that are there and then force air back out of where the funnel is. So far, it seems like it has been a success. But I just don't know until I pull the Mahiki out tomorrow how clean it's going to be. And also some masks may present problems in the future, so that type of mold may not be viable for everything. It is a test at the end of the day, and worst case scenario, if it doesn't work, I can just cut out a funnel where the mouth attaches in the silicone itself. So I can add a funnel to it. That's the nice thing about casting in silicone, is you don't have to attach the piece to a funnel. You can cut the funnel out afterward if you want to. So in order to do that, I actually cast a bed of silicone in here so that when I place the mask in, it's not sitting on the bottom of the cup, but it's actually sitting on a little bit of silicone, and then I'll backfill the rest of it with silicone. So essentially it's 3 steps for the Komau. It's this step of mixing the silicone, allowing a bed to sit, then plugging these holes and filling only the cavity in here with silicone until it rises above any of the holes in the mask, allowing that to cure. Then when that is cured, putting that in the cup with the silicone, taking the clay off obviously and cleaning the mask up, applying my mold release to the eye holes and to any holes in the mask on the top side, and then pouring in the rest of my silicone. So that's part 3. It does mean doing this with silicone 3 times, but if it presents a clean mask, then I think it is worth it. The last thing I wanted to mention is with a mold like this, you really want to wait until the full cure time of your piece has gone by, because it is definitely going to put the most stress on the piece when it comes to removing it from the mold. So masks with more holes in it, for example, are obviously going to struggle, especially if the holes are towards the base. But as long as you're kind of smart with your incision points with the knife and extracting it from the mold, you should be able to account for some of this. Like I said, it's not going to work for everything, but certain scenarios, in theory, it should work for. The mold today is my in practice, so I can say tomorrow if it works. And last thing I should mention too is that today I'm doing another fun cast. Normally I would not do this 2 days in a row, but again, I wanted to test this mold out, and also I wanted to make sure I could get enough product out for people who wanted to buy things, because they're so far selling reasonably quick. So that's pretty much it for this video, and I'll see y'all in the next one if I don't trip over my own words. Hope you guys had a happy Halloween, and as always, my links are in the description below. So, later.